Without barracks, there were barns. Without barns, there were tents. Without tents, there were wigwams. But sometimes there was nothing. Hey everyone, Tyler here from the Battalion Company of the 10th Regiment. Today we'll be talking a little bit about the British Army camp during the American Revolutionary War. From where they lived to how they lived. We'll be going into detail about their daily lives between foraging, cooking, drilling, training, and what they would do for fun. The British Army's presence in North America necessitated the establishment of camps. These camps would differ depending on the situation and the campaign in which the soldiers found themselves. Housing in these camps varied widely, ranging from well-constructed barracks to small temporary structures like tents and wigwams. The diversity of these dwellings mirrored the challenges that the men would face from day to day. A soldier's journey would start on a ship sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. These ships were often private vessels leased to the Royal Navy and would vary in size, carrying an average of 1, 2, maybe even 3 companies at a time. Every voyage was different. One might have a man fall overboard during a particularly bad storm. Another might have disease running rampant, whereas a third might make it across the ocean unmolested. In any case, when the soldiers made it to shore, a camp was required to be set up. Boston in 1774 and 75 saw a large force of regulars being sent to the city, among which was the 10th. Most of these soldiers would be garrisoned at Fort William, modern-day Fort Independence on Castle Island, and various barracks throughout Boston, or would set up tents on Boston Common during the summer. During the winter, harsh weather, or when it was available, soldiers would stay in vacant houses, barns, churches, and other various large buildings. Contrary to popular belief and the Quartering Act of 1774, British soldiers would only stay in homes inhabited by civilians if absolutely necessary when on garrison duty during the winter. Additionally, soldiers whose families owned houses near the barracks would be able to stay with them, but would adhere to strict rules to prevent any incidents from occurring. During wartime, a barracks may be constructed, though these were likely designed to be temporary and none currently exist. A peacetime barracks in Trenton, New Jersey has been restored and is now a museum. It serves as a great example for what a barracks would have looked like at the time. If there was not sufficient housing for soldiers on garrison duty during the wintertime, temporary huts would be built. These will have been constructed out of wood and earth and would have accommodated up to 24 men at a time. And when near a fort or city, a camp could be transported to better ground. These shelters would have only been used when a regiment was on garrison duty or near a town or a city. But what would happen if they were too far from the nearest fort or loyalist-held city and there were no buildings around to provide shelter? When far from the relative comfort of a large city or fort, or during the summer, regiments would oftentimes set up camp using tents. These tents historically would have housed 5 men, with mattresses made of straw and each man having his own blanket. Tents would be arranged in rows. The front of each row would have a bell tent in which the soldiers' arms would be housed. At the rear of the tent rows would be the officers' tents, and behind those would be the kitchens. On cold days and during the winter, these tents would be encased in earth, which would help insulate and protect it from the cold and harsh weather. On rainy days, if a tent didn't have the proper drainage, the soldiers inside, as well as their belongings, would be thoroughly soaked. And on windy days, the tents would sometimes be torn apart, especially if they had seen sufficient use. Each tent would have the name of its regiment, company, and number printed on it, which when folded up would always be visible. When not in use, the tents themselves would be loaded onto the baggage train, which could have been a horse or oxen-drawn cart or carriage, boats, or just the horses themselves, and the tent's poles would occasionally be carried by the men. The baggage train would travel behind the main force of regulars, who would sometimes have to wait several days for it to catch up. When this would happen, soldiers would construct temporary huts out of branches and other foraged materials, called wigwams, which were described as huts used in America. Wigwams would offer a quicker response to the sounding of the alarm. In some cases, entire battalions could be turned out in about a minute. However, these wigwams were typically used by light battalions as they were separate from the main army. The men would carry blankets with them, and when no shelter was available, or if it was intended to be a short expedition, They would sleep only under the blanket. If they were lucky, they would have straw to lie on, but oftentimes they would sleep on top of washcoats and other clothing, or even just the ground itself, with either a knapsack or a rock as a pillow. Light infantry companies, due to being ahead of the main force, would often not sleep in tents, sleeping instead in their blanket rolls. Beyond the shelter that housed them, everyday life was just as important in characterizing a British Army camp of the time. Communal kitchens in garrisons formed bonds among soldiers as they shared and cooked their daily rations. Soldiers were organized into small teams known as messes, in which men would cook and eat together. Orders from Boston in June of 1774 read, "A ration of fresh meat consists of 1 pound of beef and 1 pound of flour per day." With no refrigeration, meat was butchered and distributed quickly. Older and less desirable meat was salted and were known as salt rations. Boston orders from the same period wrote that a week of salt rations were 4 pounds of pork, 3 pints of peas, 6 ounces of butter, half a pint of rice, and 7 pounds of bread or flour per week. However, as with shelters, food often differed depending on the situation and campaign. For example, soldiers in the 18th Regiment in Boston on April 19, 1775, the day of the battles of Lexington and Concord, were issued 3/4 of a pound of cheese in place of their pork ration, which was significantly lighter should they have to march out to Concord to join the battle. Soldiers would more often than not carry food in their haversacks, which would only last them a few days. When running low on food, foraging parties, typically from light infantry companies, would be sent out to collect local vegetation such as nuts, fruits, berries, and vegetables, and hunt local game like deer or rabbit, as evidenced in 1777 by the 40th Regiment being sent out to gather some greens. With more long-term food solutions being with baggage, which was often delayed, men would often cook with small kettles, as these were lighter and could be carried by individual soldiers. In desperate times, soldiers would turn to looting. However, this was frowned upon, and several orders were issued by the Army to prohibit this with strict punishment for offenders. In camp, regiments did their best to keep soldiers from becoming lethargic during the day, oftentimes assigning them to various work parties, posting them as sentries, or spending the afternoon drilling with the men. Drills could range from practicing the 1764 manual exercise to large-scale maneuvering and target practice. This would enhance a soldier's marksmanship and combat abilities and would transform the men into a more cohesive unit where they would be able to learn light infantry tactics, which were adopted by the Army as a whole by the end of the war. Additional tasks included manual labor, foraging for food, cooking, making repairs, cleaning the camp, and maintaining your kit in good order. When on garrison duty, soldiers would oftentimes take up civilian jobs. However, this would cause a great deal of tension between soldiers and civilians in Boston. Beyond the struggles of war, leisure and recreation served as essential means to maintain morale and camaraderie. Card games, sports, and music provided soldiers respite from the tensions of military life and kindled a sense of unity amidst the challenges they faced. Music played a significant role in boosting morale and camaraderie. Soldiers often sang songs and played musical instruments like the fife and drum. Military bands provided entertainment when available. Contrary to popular belief, sanitization was extremely important in maintaining a British Army camp of the time. Camps were cleaned multiple times a day to prevent the spread of disease. However, without 21st century medical knowledge, an outbreak was bound to happen at some point. One of the biggest threats to soldiers in these camps was disease. Contagious illnesses like cholera, typhus, dysentery, and smallpox ran rampant throughout these camps. Bad weather, poor living conditions, and exposure to insects would often cause an outbreak to occur. Medical care in Army camps during the 18th century was rudimentary at best. The understanding of infectious diseases was limited, and medical practitioners lacked the knowledge and resources to effectively combat these health challenges. Medical treatment primarily consisted of purging, bloodletting, and other ineffective remedies. Consequently, the death toll from diseases is estimated to be much higher than that of combat deaths, with some estimates ranging up to 10 times as many deaths from illness than combat. Surgeon Reed of the 29th Regiment documented over 2,000 cases during his time in North America. These documents provide a small window into the prevalence of disease in a British Army camp at the time. Over a 34-month period, Reed recorded 370 cases of remitting fever and 368 cases of dysentery, with the latter being the leading cause of fatalities in the 29th between 1778 and 82, with a total of 17. This meant that over a 3-year period, a large majority of the men in the regiment, which at full strength would have been nearly 500 men, would have been infected at one point. Reed also discusses other ailments such as scurvy, which, while not fatal, caused 88 cases in 34 months, as well as 92 cases of rheumatism. We sleep up on the seashore, nothing to shelter us from the violent rains but our coats, or our miserable paltry blankets. There is nothing that grows on this island, it being a mere sandbank, and a few bushes which harbor millions of mosquitoes, a greater plague than there can be in hell itself. In short, British Army camps during the American Revolution provided a diverse and challenging environment for soldiers. From well-constructed barracks to temporary structures like wigwams and tents, a soldier's housing varied depending on the situation. Life in these camps revolved around communal kitchens and adapting to different rations used during campaigns. The soldiers' days were filled with drilling, training, and maintaining equipment. With leisure activities like sports and games and music providing a much-needed morale boost to the men, these camps offer valuable insights into the human aspect of the American Revolution. The men with their forage caps drawn over their ears huddle together under the trees or crowd round cheerless, smoky fires, complaining of their commissaries, the rain, and the Americans. Thank you for watching.